was born in England before the war in 1937, and my dad went off to, he was a doctor, he went off to fight in the war, so we went off to Ireland where my grandparents had a hotel, and we lived there for a while. And then I had a pretty fascinating life, really. My dad came back from the war in Burma, and my brother and I were still young at boarding school in Ireland, and one day the headmaster came into the classroom that we were at. It was Friday the 13th of June 1947, so I was almost 10 years old, and he said, your dad's here. And we didn't know that my dad was anywhere in the country even, so we went out, and my dad said, go upstairs and get changed, we want to take you out for tea. So we got into our little best tweed suits and put on our ties and got ourselves all done up. And we got into this big gray kind of a Dodge car, 1940-something Dodge car. And away we went in a very foggy day, and we were about 10 minutes out of the town. And my brother said to my dad, he said, where are we going? Where's the restaurant we're going for tea in? And he said, oh, we're not going for tea, we're going to Rhodesia. A shiver ran down my spine, and I'm going, Rhodesia? Give me a break. So anyway, that's how we ended up in Africa. I spent 12 years in Africa. I went through high school, university, and everything else, back to England. And then I was hanging around with a lot of wild guys, wild colonials in London in 1959, 1960. And there was a man called Max Ward who ran charter flights across the Atlantic. And so I got on one of the early Max Ward charter flights to come to Canada. And we couldn't leave the day we were supposed to leave because the headwinds on the North Atlantic were too strong. And this airplane, which was a DC-4, which is a little bigger than a DC-3, we had to fly from London to Scotland to Iceland to Greenland to Newfoundland to Toronto. Hippity hop. So I arrived in Canada in 1960. And then I came out west, and because that was the place to be. And all my buddies started skiing, and so we went down to Mount Baker because Whistler wasn't even here then. We went down to Mount Baker, and they pushed me out between a couple of trees on the top of a bit of a steep hill and said, turn, you bastard, turn! So that's how I learned how to turn. And I twisted my knee and got kind of cracked up a bit then, but that's when I first met the ski patrol people, and ultimately I got attached to those guys, and we used to drink in the Devonshire every night in Vancouver. And we got wind of the fact there was going to be a new ski area started in a place called Alta Lake, and the mountain was called Whistler, and we said, yeah. So I came up here in '65 to take a look. So I came up here and looked around, and there was no road. The road was still being built, and so I came up on the train, and I stayed at Jordan's Lodge in one of their little cabins on the side of the lake. And the second time we came up, we drove in a Volkswagen, a friend of mine, Volkswagen. In those days, to go skiing up here, everybody either drove a Volkswagen Bug or Land Rover, old, big, clunky Land Rover. So we drove up in this Volkswagen and went up the West Ridge of Whistler, where the microwave station is, because the road was still up there. And this was August. And we had our skis on. We arrived up there, and Glenn Creelman was there. Glenn Creelman used to work for the BC Rail in their transmission communication division. So he was up there servicing the microwave repeater station, and we drove up the hill with the smoking clutch on this Volkswagen, because it's a really grunt of a road. And he looked at us and he said, what the hell are you guys doing here? And we said, well, we're going skiing. And he said, well, you know, it's August, you know. So we put our skis on our back, and we walked up through the trees, and we walked right up to the West Ridge of Whistler, and we peered over the edge down into Whistler Bowl, and there we could see them building not the roundhouse, it wasn't started yet, but building the chairlift top station on the red chair, and cutting the ski runs. So then we skied down, and we got a bit mixed up, and the buddy I was with said we had to go this way, and I said no, we had to go that way, and we ended up on a cliff, and we got stuck there for a while. We got down the mountain again. So the next time I came back up was to work on the ski patrol. I took the training with the toboggan and one thing and another. And when Whistler opened in February of 1966, I was one of the men who came up and wore the brown jackets, and that's how I got started here. And then I went to Aspen for a year, and they worked with the ski patrol there as an illegal alien. I always like that phrase, illegal alien. Moved my old Volvo every 4 or 5 days in Aspen, because if you left it parked too long in one place with the out-of-state license on, the state patrol would figure you were up to no good, so they would come along and check you out, you know. So I did a year there. I did a winter there, and then I came back, and Whistler said, would you like to work on the Pro Patrol here? And I said, well, I don't know anything about that. And they said, no, but neither does anybody else. And I said, well, Holly, I've only got 1 year behind me as a volunteer patroller. how can I possibly be on the ski patrol? And they said, no, you can do it. So that was how the first ski patrol started, and it was myself, Murray Coates, who's still here, a guy called Georgie Bruce from Scotland, whose father owned a ski resort up in the Cairngorms, and a young 17-year-old fellow called Hughie Smythe from New Westminster. And we were the definitive first ski patrol on Whistler Mountain, and we ran the whole shitteroo. We ran all the accidents, we ran all the avalanche, we did everything. I mean, it was pretty hairy. We got buried a lot. We got the safety procedures that we used to knock avalanches down and everything else would not be tolerated today. We didn't even talk about the WCB. I fired Huey once because he went off skiing the powder when he was supposed to be working on the mountain. And he went back down the bottom and talked to Jack Bright or somebody who was the mountain manager at the time and got his job back. So he came back up again, and I said, what are you doing back? Oh, he said, they reversed your decision. So I was then a little pissed, so I went back down and said, you know, if I'm doing the job. But anyway, he stayed. And look where he is today. So that was that. And that year I lived, I guess I was one of the early squatters here. I lived in a trailer, 15-foot trailer. I went to a place in Richmond and I said, what do you do with your rental trailers in the wintertime? I mean, you don't take them out on the road, you know. They just sit in storage. And they said, yeah. I said, I got a deal for you. I'd really like to rent one of your trailers for the winter. And they said, what are you going to do with it? Oh, I said, I'm going to take it up to that ski place, you know, up there, and just kind of leave it there for, you know. I wasn't tell them I was going to live in it full time. So I said, how much are you going to charge me for the winter season? And they said, $550 for the season. I said, oh, done. So I dragged this 15-foot trailer up here behind my Land Rover and took it over to the parking lot, halfway between where Dusty's is and where the bottom of the Creekside Gondola is, Quicksilver, and jacked it up on bricks and put some insulation under it and put some plywood around it. And there was about 6 or 7 of us living there. I think Murray Campbell was one of them, and Richard Humanick and a few others, and it was called Bear Gulch because bears used to come through. And we had no electricity and no water, no nothing. We used the washing facilities in the day lodge, and I had this oil lamp, you see, and I would, you'd shut all the doors and windows when you're in there, but the trouble is you keep running out of air. So when you had a party in there and there were some guys in there, you kept running out of air. So if you had this little oil lamp cranked up, it was a bit like the miner's lamp. When the light started to flicker and go out, you knew you had to open the door to let some more air in because you're running out of air, you see. And then so then you turned the light and went to bed, and then the morning when you get up, the condensation inside the trailer had frozen, so you couldn't open the door. So you had to get out and take a pee, and you couldn't get out the door. So then you had to light the light, put it down by the door, and let it work for a few minutes to melt the ice off the inside of the door. You could give the door the old boot, and then get out, you know, and to do your business in the snow, which was fun. So that was kind of, I guess there are guys living like that today too. So those are the early days.
So what happened after that? You left again and you came back?
Yeah, I went to Grouse Mountain for a year. The year after the Grouse Mountain chairlift ran backwards and broke a few backs, they decided they needed somebody in charge of safety. So when I got here, there wasn't any evacuation procedure of any consequence to get people off a chairlift if it broke down. So I went nosing around down to Washington State, and I found that there was a seat. I can't remember the name of it now, but I found one in the museum the other day down at a function. There was a special seat that you could build that you could pull up to somebody on a chairlift on a rope. You stick it between your legs, and then take your weight off the seat of the chairlift, and the ski patrol on the other end would pull this rope up and then let you down off the lift, and that was kind of standard evacuation procedure. So I designed some of those and had them here at Whistler. But then when Grouse Mountain had the bad accident and they had no evacuation equipment, I went there, and they gave me they paid me $100 a month more than I was getting here, and they gave me a fancy title of safety supervisor, and they said, now you're in charge of safety. So I had the same kind of thing to do, except they don't get avalanches there, but they get really tough snow conditions. And I mean, in those days we didn't have any groomers. It wasn't a question of getting out with a machine. I mean, here at Whistler, for example, we would go down the line up in the gondola in the morning because we knew there was a bad snow condition up there, like wind crust or wind blown. We'd go down the gondola line in the morning, or we'd wait till guys got to mid-station, and we'd say, do you want a free day skiing tomorrow? Or would you like, you know, to get a free day skiing some other day next weekend? Because if you come work for us for a couple of hours, we'll give you a free day skiing. So they would we got 50 people, and we took them up the red chair, and everybody jumped off and shoveled it out and got going. And this, on occasion, the crust was really bad. And we'd set these guys side by side, 50 people, sidestepping down the blue chair, down the hill. And they had to make 2 passes from top to bottom, down the blue chair. Then we would open the mountain, and that's where they got their free skiing from. So that was sort of the days before, you know, get in the machine and groom it. When I got to Grouse Mountain, I tried to pull that trick, and the first day it was a really bad, crusty day. It was Wednesday. Wednesday was Ladies' Day on the mountain, and all these housewives come up from North Vancouver, and they didn't ski too well. But they were sort of infatuated by the lifestyle and the ski instructors and everything else, and the mountain really thought it was kind of cool. These ladies were coming up here to learn how to ski. Well, the first Wednesday, or early in the time I was there, we got a really bad Wednesday when there was a wind crust and stuff on top of the snow that was just like hollow drum, and you could just fall through it just by looking at it. It was just unstable as whatever. So I said to the mountain management, we can't open the mountain, it's not safe. And they said, no, we got to open the mountain. So we had to go out and try and beat this crust to death by foot in order to have these ladies go and ski. So I did a year on Grouse Mountain, and then I went back into the printing business. And then I got married in '71, and Jane worked for the House Sound School Board. She worked for a year in Britannia Beach. And then the next year she got offered, teachers were plentiful in those days, and jobs weren't too plentiful. And I'd built a little A-frame here in 1969 for, the lot cost me $4,200, and I think with the house on it, it cost me $8,000 to build this A-frame. And then I dug out the basement with a pick and shovel later in a wheelbarrow, so the whole thing cost me 13 grand, as I recall, for everything, up and running. So when Jane got offered a job in Pemberton, I said, she said, what are we going to do now? And I said, no. I said, well, we could go and live at Alta Lake. And she said, well, what'll I do? And I said, we're going to have to drive to Pemberton every day, and I'll find something to do. So we moved up here in '71, and I went back to becoming a volunteer ski patroller. And all my drinking buddies in the Devonshire Hotel in Vancouver, whom we used to bump into, you know, as a regular weekly event on a Friday night, and they said, what are you going to do up there? You'll starve. There's nothing to do at Alta Lake. There's nobody there. And I said, well, you know, probably 100 residents, full-time, and then, you know, maybe 700 or 800 on, with including the skiers that come up that are permanent residents, the weekender residents. And a big day on the mountain was like 1,000 people, 1,200 people, which, considering the gondola only took up 900 people an hour, that was a big day anyway. So we came up and moved into our little A-frame, and Jane had a little Isuzu car, and in the back she had a sleeping bag and a shovel and like a survival kit. And we had marked on the road to Pemberton, which was a gravel road with a couple of one-lane bridges, really a glorified logging road. We had denoted where the point of no return was, PNR. So if she was on the Whistler, the Alta Lake side of that, going to school in the morning, and things got tough, she'd come back. But if she was on the other side of that and things got tough, she still had to keep on going. And then one of the factors was, of course, that it is all downhill to Pemberton. So it was, you know, it was better to go further on than to start trying to come back up the hill again. But she didn't ever get stuck, but she did have some interesting experiences with black ice and traffic roads. And even the main highway, if you came up on a Friday night in those days, as I said earlier, you had to drive either a Volkswagen or a Land Rover, and you couldn't be sure if you came up on a Friday night that you'd get through. Because the Cheakamus Canyon used to avalanche regularly. And the other interesting thing was that where we stayed up here, after I moved out of my little trailer and we were still volunteers in the early days, they had this Atco trailer complex at the bottom of what is presently, you know, the Dusty's complex there. And during the week, Monday to Friday, Quadra Construction, who were working on the building, had their workers staying there. Well, they stayed Monday to Friday. And then on Friday afternoon, they all went back to the city, and we drove up on Friday night. And so we took the same beds they'd been sleeping in. But if you got there late, you didn't get a bed, so you slept on the floor. So there's always an incentive to get up earlier on a Friday to go work the next morning on a Saturday. And if you made the mistake of coming to work early on Saturday morning, then you had the problem of having nowhere to sleep at all. And you had to definitely sleep on the floor. So we started a married life here, and things went on. We managed Alpine Village, where Trudeau had a place, and we were always, and when Trudeau and Margaret were honeymooning here, with the RCMP, were all over the Alta Lake like a rash, and we had to look after them. and make sure the security was in place and everything else. And that was an interesting experience, running 52 condominium units for rental, and some of the owners were the weekend people from Vancouver that were the early investors in Whistler Mountain and the Garibaldi Lift Company. So we did that for a few years, and then Whistler became incorporated as a town in 1975, and I was the president of the Ratepayers Association. And it's funny, you know, 25 years ago or 20 years ago plus, the situation we had is very similar to what it is today. You know, dogs running around, garbage being around, bears and people conflict. And one of my jobs as president of the Ratepayers, we were in charge of the garbage dump. The garbage dump's where the Delta Hotel is today. That's another story. So I had to go, and there was a little stub road off the highway, and the visitors used to all go in there with their vehicles to watch the bears. And the bears are all in the trench digging garbage up and whatever, and they always got a little too close to the bears for my comfort, and I was worried that they were going to get, there was going to be sort of an incident between bears and people. So I had a hard hat and a whistle and a black and white dog. And I would drive up in my Land Rover, and I would see all these people watching the bears and jumping, standing around taking before the days of video, so we were taking movies of little Johnny with his wiener to go and feed the bears, so they thought they were in the zoo. And I would leap out of my Land Rover with my dog and my whistle and my hard hat, and I would beat on my hard hat, and blow my whistle, and start shouting like a wild thing, you know, and all these people would look. And of course the bears would jump up out of the trench, and the dog would see the bears and go tearing after the bears, and the bears would go up the tree, and then they would scatter because, you know, and the people would just get really mad at me. Why did you do that? And I said, well, we just want to make sure the bears understand that we aren't all friendly, and otherwise they're likely to take a swing at you, you see. So every couple of days I would get down to the dump and do my bear patrol, just to remind the bears that people were not always friendly and to keep the people and the bears separate. And then they started, so 75 they built, Bristol was incorporated, and I ran for mayor because I was president of the Ratepayers, and the other guy who was high profile here was Pat Carleton, and he was president of the Chamber of Commerce, and that was the only kind of local government we had. So I was persuaded to run for mayor against him, and I didn't get elected, and he got elected, and that was fine. You know, any election when you don't get elected, there's always a kind of a downer afterwards. So I went off, and I skied for that winter and did a few things. And the next spring, I said, "Now what are we going to do now?" I think I was on the school board at that time. I said, "What am I going to do now?" Well, Jane and I sat down and decided that there were two things that Whistler needed. One was a bus company, transit system, and the other was a newspaper. So we looked into the transit system and decided that I didn't have $20,000 to buy an old converted school bus or two in order to start a bus company, which later was started. Somebody called it Snow Goose Transportation, and it did exist. So I had a background in printing, and so I decided we'd start the newspaper. So I phoned up a friend of mine in Upper Island, Port McNeil or somewhere, and said, who was an editor of the newspaper, publisher, and I said, "What do you need to get a newspaper started?" Oh, he said, "You just need a typewriter and a girl to work for you, and a community that needs a paper, and a press pass." I said, "How do I get a press pass?" He said, "You make it up. I mean, you're in the printing business, you make your own press pass." Oh, I said, "Okay, you make your own press pass." So then he said, and the most important thing about having a newspaper is you got to get your billings right. So there we started. We had part-time staff working in my basement in Alpine Meadows on a rented IBM typewriter and a Gestetner machine, and that's how the Whistler Question started. So that took me that was an interesting time. I sat on the school board while I was running the newspaper, but I decided it wasn't appropriate to try and get elected to council because that would have been too much of a conflict. So that stayed on. We sold the newspaper in '83 when it became too much of a business and not a creative thing anymore. And Jane and I went off traveling around the world for 13 months, which was a real privilege and exciting. And then I came back and I ran for council again and served a total of 5 years on the council, which was also very interesting. And skied. I mean, I still ski. I work on Blackcomb as a host and have done that for about 5 years. It still keeps me in touch with reality. I don't go leaping off tall buildings or cliffs or do avalanche control anymore because my legs are getting a little old for that. But it's been fascinating. I think the longer you stay here, the more you realize that change is what's happening in Whistler or Alta Lake and then Whistler. And the longer you stay here, the more you can project into the future, because the further back you can look by taking that line up. If you can look back where you've been, you can see forward where you're going. And I guess if I have to make a comment about spending a long time in a community, the advantage of it is that you do see then and now and the future. The downside is that you don't always like what is going on, but that's not bad. I don't have a problem with that. It's been interesting. If I had to do it all over again, I'd do it all over again. And you know, it's interesting when you listen to the people who are here, who've only recently arrived, and they've been here a couple of years or 5 years or 7 years or whatever, and they say, oh, it's not the way it used to be. You know, there are traffic problems. I mean, I can remember the first traffic light. I can remember the first commercial building at Whistler was down in Creekside, where I had to buy a company in order to get office space, because there was no office space available. The Delta Hotel was our first high-rise. It was built in '82. And it went in exactly where the garbage dump was that I used to go in and chase the bears out of. And when they excavated for the parking garage under the Delta, they couldn't figure out what all these car bodies and garbage bags and smelly pockets of unspeakable whatever it was that was coming out of the ground. I mean, and we all said, well, we told you there was a garbage dump here, you know. And I mean, that was the same garbage dump we used to ski down to before the lifts were there to the bottom of the Olympic run, and hitchhike back to the base because there was no bus service. Or perhaps Sandy Martin would come along in his truck and we'd all hang on the back with a rope and get pulled down the highway, ski joring behind an old pickup. I mean, you imagine today the way we are civilized here with our fancy highway and all the salt on the roads, all the traffic lights and everything else. You imagine coming around the corner and seeing 10 guys coming along down the road tied on the back of a truck with a knotted old rope. I mean, you'd have a bird. I mean, it wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have much snow anymore. Now everybody gets rid of the snow, you know. In those days, the snow there was more of it, and they didn't take as much trouble getting rid of it. So we drove on the snow, and snow was a part of the life here, even in the town. Now it's the thing to do now with the snow is to get rid of it. I was in Aspen when you could ski right down the middle of the main street in Aspen, coming off the mountain, right down the main street past the bank. You'd see people coming down, and it was before the days of bank machines, but they had drive-in banks. And the guys would come skiing down the sidewalk and just do their banking transaction while they still had their skis on. And I remember skiing right through the village when it was first built, right across to the pharmacy, without missing a step. I mean, you could ski right into town. But these days, safety is more of an issue. I ramble on.
So to sum it all up, Paul, you've had a good life.
Yeah,
living in Whistler?
I don't have a problem. It's different now. I mean, and it'll be another different again in 20 years. I mean, you know, the balance between employee and community on the one hand, and business and tourism and employer on the other, is there. But it's, you know, it's a little bit like a union management relationship, I guess, that has to find its own way through. And there are times when it's, you know, the going gets a little rough, and there are always more people trying to come here than we have room for, and there always will be. No matter how much accommodation we build here, this place has reached the point of famousness in the world, where there's always going to be more people coming here than we can possibly look after. So, on the Darwinian theory, the smartest and the fittest and the most enterprising will survive. And yeah, and as I said, if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it all over again. It's I live a little healthier than I used to, but you know, we all abuse our bodies in our 20s and 30s, and then in our 50s and 60s we suddenly realize we shouldn't have done it, so we try and make up for it. So, but it's been great, and I got a lot of friends here who've still been here through thick and through thin, and I'm sure they have stories to share similar to the ones I have, and one of these days I'd like to write a book about my experiences at Whistler, and you've heard a little bit of it right here. There's no substitute for having experienced life. And life here in the old days was, I mean, it was a bit like living in the Northwest Territories, you know. We had to, it was very, it wasn't expensive as much as it was inconvenient, but it was expensive because it was inconvenient. And we had no, you know, food stores. We had freezers. We had root cellars to keep our root vegetables in through the winter. We bought our meat and from the farms in Pemberton and in bulk, frozen and wrapped, and it was very different. And if our friends came up from Vancouver to go skiing, we'd say, "Oh, bring us some lettuce, or bring us an avocado, or bring us some fresh stuff," because we haven't seen fresh stuff for so long, you know. But Canada even has changed. I mean, in those days, we weren't getting our apples and our vegetables from Chile and Argentina and South Africa and Israel and all over the world where they're coming from today. So the times have changed globally, never mind just here. But it's been particularly noticeable here. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it all over again.
Thanks, Paul. Wow.
So there.
That was good.
Anyway, you'll be able to use some of
The whole
that.
idea of the book, you know, I mean, if I keep going along with this, you'll be able to use it for your research.
Yeah. No. Well. Yeah. I mean, I'm courses now, and the reason I got involved doing computer work is that I just want to be able to start. I mean, they're dying. You know, that's the problem, Paul. Let's be blunt about it. I mean, the people are dying.
Well,
Sid Young is gone, and Rudy Hoffman is gone, and you know, I could name half a dozen others. Dave Lowry killed in an avalanche, Paul Rondo killed in an avalanche. You know, there's a number of guys that are just poof. And some of them are younger than I am. Some of them are a little older, but mostly my age. And you realize, you know, and people like Pat Carlton are not going to live forever, ever. Jim McConkie will probably live forever, so that's different. But you know, some of the others, and Franz Willemsen's getting a little long in the tooth. He's getting older, and but it, you know, the links with the past. If you want to tell stories, you have to be, well, there are two ways to tell stories. One of them is you can wait till everybody else dies off, and then you can tell stories because nobody's going to contradict you. Well, the other is you can tell stories because you can go to these people and say, that's the way it was.
That's why, you know.
And you're right. I mean, when Tim Cornish was here and he did Myrtle, for instance, I mean, I know that it was a tough time for the Museum and Archives because he was the kind of guy who was more interested in making a name for himself than he was for making a name for Alta Lake. But still, some of the work he did with Myrtle was absolutely invaluable when he sat down with his tape recorder and he got an oral history from her of what happened at Whistler. And I don't know what's the status.
I don't know where that is.
But he sat down.
Oh, yeah, no, I know I know.
And he did an oral history
The museum has those.
The museum has those tapes. And he did Myrtle. You know, voice. He's got Myrtle's voice on tape, which you could use.
We could use that
with some of those old photographs of Myrtle and Bob the Horse and Teddy the Bear and all of those things that Myrtle was famous for. There are stories to go with all those pictures in her own words. And I mean, there was a lot of controversy because he wanted to make a name for himself and he wanted to charge everybody a fortune for what he did. But the work that he did is still invaluable for Whistler. You know.
Well, that's kind of the whole idea for this. Is what I thought is, you know, by getting it on video and getting people, you know, I mean, 30 years you're not going to be here probably.
No, that's right.
Hey. So, you know, these folks will be here. People will be able to plug these in or have the record and go, wow, you know, wow, I never knew that.
Yeah.
That was cool.
And even on a shorter term, you mentioned the people who have recently arrived. To be able to have something like this.
Yeah.
I teach the Whistler Spirit course, you know, and I'm one of the trainers, okay, and the other trainers are mostly a lot younger than I am. Florence goes in every now and then to give the historical component of it, but mostly when we teach it, I teach the whole thing. Well, I mean, to talk to these young kids, they're just blown away, you know. When you listen, think about it. I mean, I'm older. I've been here longer than they've been born.
Yeah.
Lots of them.
Right.
Most of them, you know. When I tell them I've been here for 30 years, skiing here for 30 years, they all go, you know, they don't think anybody skied 30 years ago.
Right.
They thought there was no such thing as skis and boots in those days. I mean, you know. So it's really hard. You say, well, this is the life was here, and I was a ski bum, and 30 years ago, and they all go, oh boy, you know. It's really quite startling. I mean, here they are 18, 20 years old, and it's 1 year out of their life that they've come here from Australia or England or wherever,
yeah.
You know. And
well, even I was up in Pemberton last night, and the people I was with had a book on the history of Pemberton.
oh yeah, I've got that one. Yeah, I got that book. Yes.
And I was amazed how thick it was.
Oh yeah, the Pemberton Valley. I mean, the Pemberton Valley has more history than the Whistler Valley.
Oh,
Yeah.
much more.
Because they've been around a long time. And I mean, and one of the reasons Pemberton's having a little difficulty with their development, A, is that it's It was a very small town, and it's been growing really fast,
Yeah.
by relatively speaking. And it's, they're just not, I mean, it's not that they're not coping with it well, it's just that it should never have happened to them.
Right.
I mean, and what happened here is pretty intense in any event, but what's happened there is almost a travesty as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Because all the old timers and the old values that they had, gone. Gone.
Oh, yeah.
So now people are moving out of Pemberton and going back to Squamish, because at least Squamish has got some kind of a base there still, whereas Pemberton, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm going to get close-ups.
Anyway, that's, but I mean, Pemberton has a long history, and Alta Lake, I mean, the history of Alta Lake is well documented. It really only started around the turn of the century, and it was pretty spasmodic. It was some logging and some mining and some trapping, and that was about it. Pemberton, on the other hand, has been there since, you know, long before that. And they came up the other way through Lillooet Lake and where Mount Currie is. And the Indians have been in there a long time.
Yeah.
And the farmers in the Pemberton Valley have been there since the 1850s.
Oh, sure, yeah. Potatoes.
And, you know, when Whistler first started, and Jane, it was very interesting, Jane went to teach in Pemberton, and when I came here, there was a real division along the railway line here. If you lived on the west side, which is what it was called then, and that's what the West Side Road was named after, if you lived on the west side of the tracks, you were Old Whistler, Old Alta Lake. And if you lived on the east side of the tracks, you were New Alta Lake. And all of the ski development, except for Emerald and Alpine, was on this side. And when we got together socially in the evenings, I mean, there was real hard feelings initially from the old-time people who lived on that side of the railway tracks, from the people who had come on this side. There was a real hard feeling.
403 is Alberta, right?
Yeah. Boy, you know, I went to a couple of events. I mean, I remember when the highway came through, some guy got out with a shotgun and tried to move the highway because the power lines came through, and they got out with the rifles and tried to move that. And I mean, you know, the few people that were here were pretty feisty guys in those days, but there was nobody here. Nobody here. And Pemberton it's really, if you haven't been to Pemberton for a while, boy, it really is.